Multi-hazards, all about communities.
Hello everyone, back again with a great topic, Indigenous climate adaptation in both Australia and all over the world, with Toni Hay, Indigenous climate expert. So, let's start out, as is my custom here on Multi-Hazards, with a territorial acknowledgement for where I'm living. We work, study, and live in a region south of the Stalo, aka Fraser River, which overlaps with the unceded traditional and ancestral lands of the Kwantlen, Musqueam, Katzie, Semiahmoo, Tsawwassen, Kikite, and Kwikwetlam peoples. These are the names of wonderful First Nations groups who dwell near me here in Greater Vancouver on the west coast of Canada. So my guest for today is Toni Hay. She is an author, climate expert, and environmental sustainability scientist with a passion for tackling climate change and protecting the planet. Being a descendant of the first Australian nation of Gamilaraay and having grown up in Yolngu Country, she has a rich heritage and a deeply personal connection to the environment. She's dedicated to helping raise awareness about the issues facing our climate and the vulnerable communities who bear the burden of climate change. As the winner of the 2020 award for Queensland Women in STEM, that's science, technology, engineering, and math, Toni is driven to provide feasible and practical solutions to environmental issues across Australia, New Zealand, and Oceania. She blends her scientific knowledge with her unique background, experiences, and insights to offer meaningful ways for individuals and communities to embrace sustainability and help the world's most vulnerable people. So I'm going to read the blurb, the summary of her book, which is just out. She's recently been having book launches in Australia and I believe online. And it's called Culture of Inclusion, Indigenous Climate Adaptation. So here we go. This is a thought-provoking book that offers a detailed and meaningful exploration of climate change and the essential part that Indigenous communities play, with a special focus on the role that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have in combating environmental damage, along with the Australian government's lack of inclusion and failure to seek their unique input. This book examines how climate change will impact the globe's poorest and most vulnerable communities the hardest, along with practical ways for our communities to begin taking action. Exploring the dangers that environmental catastrophe poses to Indigenous people's health, communities, and livelihoods, this book offers a down-to-earth look at the possible solutions for healing the planet, as well as powerful ways to educate people and create positive change. Culture of Inclusion, Indigenous Climate Adaptation is a must-read for environmental activists, climate scientists, Indigenous people, and anyone who is passionate about the planet. And this bio and book summary is taken from Toni Hay's Culture of Inclusion, Indigenous Climate Adaptation. All right. Again, you're in for a treat today. Without further ado, let's get to the interview. So welcome everybody to Multi-Hazards, and I'm so thrilled to have Toni Hay, and she's all the way from Australia, and today she's sitting in Brisbane. Is that how we say it, Toni? Brisbane, Australia, which is one of the bigger cities, I think, right?
Yes, that's right, Ben.
Okay. Well, it's good seeing you. I've been reading your book. I read it already. I've been kind of going back through your new book. And what's the name again? It's called Culture of inclusion, right?
Yes, culture of inclusion, culture of inclusion, Indigenous climate adaptation.
Right. Yeah, I love that book. That's good. It's just every chapter has something really rich and really deep. So it takes going through more than once. So now, Toni, I'm just wondering, how have you and all the people that you've been living with and working with, how's everybody and you personally been coping during this pandemic? Because I know it's kind of like one of the first global events that kind of affects everybody.
Yes, it's certainly been hard. All the lockdowns and everyone running out to get groceries and toilet paper. Yes, it's certainly, from an adaptation perspective, it's certainly making people rethink their way that they just take for granted, being able to just pop down to the shop or just being able to go for a walk. So even in the beginning, I noticed where I was living in New Zealand at the time, everyone was running out and buying seedlings, the little plants, the vegetable seedlings.
Oh, wow.
And it was really funny because I'm thinking why they were running out getting vegetable seedlings, and they sold out. They sold out of seeds, they sold out of seedlings. And I thought, here I am with my climate adaptation, and I've been preparing and doing the right things for the last few years, getting my house ready and, just looking after things. And I had all my seeds and I had my vegetable garden. I felt quite proud of myself.
Oh, wow.
But
yeah.
Yes, it's been a big strain on everybody.
Right. But as you were saying, it's kind of a time to rethink. So maybe just I'm talking at least all of us who are still alive, because unfortunately and sadly, many people have passed away or gotten really sick. But for those of us who managed to survive and managed to be healthy, it's been just good to rethink everything and sort of come back to nature again, I guess, in some aspects, right?
So yes, the losses is just it's just heartbreaking, and the families having to go through all of that is just, you just can't imagine people having to do that outside of a war, really. So yeah, it's very, very sad. And it does make you rethink. And, we see that climate change in general seems to have gone on a back footing with all this, with COVID, which is, understandable in one way. But in another way, it's an opportunity to start to rethink and regather and refocus on what we need to be doing for our adaptation around it as we come back out and we appreciate life more.
Right, exactly. Like when we stare death in the face, it seems we appreciate life a lot more. So, yeah. So, Toni,
yes.
I was looking
or told you can't go out.
Yes. Oh, yeah, exactly. Now, so Toni, I was looking at your LinkedIn, and I see that you have a really rich background in science and in environmental work. So I'm wondering if you could tell everybody what that's all about.
Yes, I'm an environmental sustainability scientist, and I've been working in climate adaptation, developing plans because, well, not just because I'm Indigenous, but I was researching 7 countries to put together climate adaptation plans. And when I was looking at those 7 countries, I realised that there was very little there for the most vulnerable in our communities, and even less so for Indigenous people. So even to have, that traditional knowledge or local knowledge, there just wasn't that opportunity. So, it's when I started thinking that we much here from the input of local peoples, and also our vulnerables aren't being looked after enough through these mainstream adaptation plans. So that's when I thought, how do I get this out? How do I get people to start thinking about this? It's so important. So I thought, look, I've never written a book before, but I think my message is important. And so that's when I started putting this together. So I started about 2 years ago. I finished my book about a year ago, and I've been holding on to it, a little bit nervous to put it out there. So in the end, I just thought, I'll just throw it out there and see what happens. So yeah, that's kind of how it's sort of evolved. And I was just surprised. all the adaptation plans are very much mainstream. Not many at all reach the most vulnerable peoples in our communities. You know, that could be the homeless, that could be women, it could be children. It doesn't go right down to where it needs to be. It's just across that middle strip. And it's very worrying, considering when you start to look at the research and what's already happening and what is coming very, not far away. So when you're looking at that, we're not prepared enough. So that's why one of the reasons I wrote the book.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So I was preparing for another podcast, and somebody had written that, for example, in emergency planning, you cannot plan. For example, if there's like 20 of me, a white Canadian guy, I cannot plan for people who are Indigenous or people who are Black and brown, because I haven't lived in their shoes, and I can't imagine it. So if there's 20 of me doing all the planning, it just won't work in the end, right? You need the people from the grassroots level to be involved in the planning, right? And I think you make that argument in your book too, right?
Yes, definitely, Vin. It's about to get the stakeholder buy-in, to get that. If you're looking at shifting the way people think or the way people do things, you need to include them. They need to be part of that process and part of their, from the all the way through in the decision making. So if you can't have things made about you so much, so if you're included, you feel as though you're part of it, you feel as though you own it, and then you start to make those changes willingly, happily, and you're moving forward. It seems to be difficult for some some governments, different levels of government, but some governments find that they just do that engagement. It's like after they've already made the decisions, and and then it's just the engagement part at the end.
So I'm just wondering, what's the demographics, and also what's the situation of Indigenous people in Australia?
Well, when it comes to climate change, I was talking to someone the other day, and we're in a bit of a pickle. Mm-hmm. So, how do you say that without being, really negative? But we're actually in quite a bad way. And I don't think that the general public really realise how bad we are and how bad we're going to have it within 20, 30 years. So we're not talking 100 years, we're talking 20, 30 years. So when you're looking at the research, especially in remote communities, what we have in Australia is they call it closing the gap. So closing the gap is where they're trying to reduce the gap between Indigenous people and mainstream Australia. So it's about reducing in health, in education, across all those sorts of streams. So what we see, though, if you're comparing what's going to happen with climate change, or what is happening with climate change, is that gap will increase. So we're already fighting to get it down and reduce the gap between mainstream and Indigenous Australia. And then we haven't taken into account the impacts of climate change. So that will increase that and make it bigger, that gap. And it's, as I was saying, it's not very far off that these things are going to be quite obvious. We're going to be looking at some major health issues. We're going to be, food sources. Over 80% of Indigenous Australians in remote communities eat subsistence food. So that's your fish and your meat. So we're already seeing that by 2050, tropical fishes will be reduced by about 40% in the warmer waters. And they're also going to be starting to grow smaller. So about a quarter smaller, I think it is. So you're going to have a nutrient deficiency there. You're going to find the animals are coming in, they already are, coming in and out of season at different times. And we're going to be finding, whatever is on country now, which is on country is your homelands. It's your family's lands that you look after. So the animals will also be moving at different times as well, so of the year to what they normally would. So all these things come into your diet, and it comes into your normal way of living, which also affects your mental health, which we already have major problems in remote communities. So all these things, as I've put in the book, they all come in, one thing, then the next thing, then the next thing. They all group together to cause a major problem. So it's not like it's going to be just one bit here and a little bit there. We have all these things affecting our different ways of life that will be impacting together to make things a lot worse, and that gap will be increasing. So it's a big worry.
Right. So the health effects of climate change, you were saying for Indigenous peoples are much more serious than, say, the so-called mainstream non-Indigenous culture there, right?
Yes, that's right, Ben.
Okay. And so what are some of those health effects? I know that where we live in North America, like, for example, there's more Lyme disease. And then if your housing is bad, then more storms and more flooding, they will kind of break down your house quicker. And then, for example, some people are very susceptible to heat waves because they live in a place maybe a little bit far from the ocean, and then a heat wave comes. So there's those kind of things that are happening there, right?
Yes, there will be heat waves. There will be, we'll have the fires, we have the droughts. We have one unusual one is because of the warmth, more snake bites are already presenting to the medical departments. So that's already occurring. And it will be around asthmas. Asthma will be an increase.
Right. Yeah.
And nutrient deficiencies through diets. So yes, it's across all those different streams. With the housing, there's in some communities there is not, there's most communities there's nowhere near enough housing. There's many people in a house already sharing, but it's not enough cyclone-proof housing. So we find in some communities there's a lot of areas and a lot of space for non-Indigenous people to go into an emergency to escape to in a cyclone. But there is not the same facilities for Indigenous people. Mm-hmm. It's quite bizarre to think in this day and age that that's still occurring. Right. And so you've got that. And
how about the bushfires? Because I remember before COVID, we're either looking at what Donald Trump in the United States is doing, all the trauma that he's causing. And then we were looking at, from here in Canada, and I think around the world, we were looking at the bushfires that were happening on Australia. And like, that freaked me out, especially, you heard about stories of what happened to the koala bears and the kangaroos and people running away. But I didn't really hear in the mainstream news how that affected Indigenous people so much in Australia.
Yes, definitely. Be major impacts for Indigenous people, major impacts for mainstream. I mean, the fires just haven't, the back burning. So the back burning hasn't occurred, which is what our people, we do traditional burning. So it's a cool, low burn.
It's like controlled burning.
That's right, controlled burning. So none of that has occurred in a lot of the high-risk areas. I do believe they might be picking up on that now, but it should have been occurring 10 years ago. They should have already started this. And I've had quite a few people come up to me and say, and ask me about if it's going to be increasing in Melbourne or Sydney with the traditional burning. So residents want it, the people in the communities want it. It's just a matter of the government going through and setting and processing and doing and setting that up. But definite need for it. It was just horrific watching those fires and the biodiversity loss. In Australia, a lot of our some of our trees do need fire to regenerate. But to the extent that those fires was just, all at once was just, just horrific. Yes, right. Just horrific.
Now, in your book, Toni, I remember you were talking about these 3 words that everybody uses in climate change adaptation. There's Okay, let me get it. There's vulnerability, and then there's resilience. And let me see, okay, so adaptation, vulnerability, and resilience. And it's funny, I mean, sorry, it's not funny, but it's just kind of odd and ridiculous that it seems that in Australia, and for example, with Indigenous people's relationship with the government is that, you call people vulnerable, it works against you when it comes to money and resources and programs or whatever. And then if they call you resilient, it also works against you. So I thought it was just so ironic. We should be using these terms in a way that it will benefit Indigenous peoples, right?
Oh, definitely. When I started looking at this, and I'm in mainstream, I'm in developing adaptation plans, and then one of the elders said to me, Toni, do you realise that either way we're in a bit of this works against us, exactly what you've said. And then I've gone, oh my goodness. So I sat back and thought about that, and they are right. So everyone, there's a huge movement, that Indigenous knowledge and it should be used, and Indigenous peoples are resilient. And yes, Indigenous knowledge definitely should be used. It should be like local knowledge, Indigenous knowledge should be included. But it's that it doesn't make us, somehow somehow we're resilient all of a sudden to the effects of climate change. We have lived through many changes throughout the years, through thousands of years. We have, 7,000 years ago, there's over 20 different areas in Australia that all acknowledge, and in the story, the song lines and the stories have shown that the water came in. So we have those stories. We know that's happened, but it's different to today in a way. We can't just move onto someone else's land anymore. We can't just, all of a sudden shift our homes like we could 7,000 years ago. Right. It's different. Right. So, we have those changes. Sorry.
No, I was saying, sorry. If you have all the resources and you have all the power, as you're saying, you can be resilient. Right? Because it takes yes. money and resources and everything to be empowered, to be resilient. But if you don't have those things, it's very limited, right?
Well, you're only resilient if your climate adaptation planning has done well. Right. So if your climate adaptation planning does not reach our most vulnerable, it doesn't reach the people who are homeless, it doesn't reach the people, all the vulnerable people that live out in remote communities or limited access or expensive foods, if it doesn't reach those people, it will never be resilient. It's just a word that sounds wonderful, and it's not ever going to eventuate. It's a dream. So to actually reach that resilience, you need to really plan a lot deeper and a lot better than what we have been doing, definitely. And it does work against us as Indigenous peoples. We are resilient, but we cannot do it alone. We cannot do it without the infrastructure. We cannot do it without the supports. We cannot do it without whole holistic community, planning. It can't be done. So yes, we could be resilient if we all worked together to make it better.
Right. But the one problem, and I think this came out of your book, is it's almost like two worlds, right? There's the sort of white mainstream Western world, or the Australian, or in my country, it's the Canadian, right? And then Indigenous people are often living in their own neighborhoods and kind of put into a box, so to speak, not as, flexible to do things or to have resources. And so there's kind of two ways of thinking. And unless the so-called mainstream is listening and engaging with Indigenous peoples, then nothing really works. Is that right?
Well, that's right. And in Australia, they're trying to just have a voice, I guess. That is it. What we do see is through agency, when the government does say that it's going to be inclusive of Indigenous, throughout decision making or through, in their processes. But what they tend to do is set up an advisory panel, or they set up a partnership, but there is a group of people that sit on the side. So what you end up with is like Indigenous people sitting on the side. It's like sitting at the little kids' table. So you're sitting at the little kids' table and you're making decisions, but over here, the government is making all the decisions still, and you have no real input. So I don't know how to explain that without actually showing my hands.
Right. The little kids' table.
Yes. Well, that is it. When you're out to the side, you can go around, you can have all the discussions you want, but you still have no authority and you have no real input. Whereas if you're actually included and embedded throughout the processes within government, then you're able to make decisions, you're about to have a say, you're about to, actually work with the government. So that's where it's missing. It keeps putting us out on the little kids' table. And it's I think that it's an attempt, but it certainly isn't in any way helping us to move forward. We are not inclusive through that process.
Now, a question about your situation in Australia. I know in Canada that, say, as a white, born in Vancouver person, I have a kind of a little bit of a distant relationship with the government. But people who are status First Nations people in Canada, the relationship is like very almost controlling of the government. So it's kind of a tight-knit relationship, whether you like it or not. So I'm wondering, is that kind of the situation that's happening in Australia?
It's very much so. And through that tight control of the government on what it will and will not do, it's created people who are always, it's almost like you're always asking, you're always wanting, you're always asking to be for something. Can we have it? Can we be included? It's never actually, it's like this constant battle. And if you're not included and people are not being heard, that's when people get, angry, or they lose faith, or they just become despondent. We can see that very easily. We start going into remote communities, just that whole feeling of hopelessness. You can go into almost any of our communities in remote Australia and it hits you. You can feel it. And it's just terrible. There's no need for that. So it is about being heard. It's about being inclusive management, or inclusive engagement, or inclusive decision-making for communities. And it's the only way that it can be run to actually be successful. So it just seems, like you were saying before, the gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people who are in management and organising. I never understood why there was this gap, because to me it seems so simple. Right. And when I've been in New Zealand and developing plans in New Zealand, it's simple, and they run them out in New Zealand inclusive, and you can see it works. So if they can do it and they can make it work, there's no reason we can't bring that here into Australia or other parts of the world, and it can also work there. It is possible, and we've now got examples. So while we have examples, we know that it can be done, and it's just about shifting those mindsets. I think sometimes people they don't know how to do it, or they're afraid of doing it. I'm not sure what the block is, or if it's just the system itself, which, is a big part of it. But it's about having those relationships. It's about allowing people in with that decision-making and, just being able to participate in their own lives and how they're going to, hopefully improve.
Right. Now, at the very beginning of your book, I think the word that you use for all of this is called agency, right? So how do you kind of define that here?
Agency. Yes. Agency. In Australia, we often use the word state and
like stakeholders.
No, right? Sorry, state. STATE. State.
Okay.
So it's agency. It's I always see it's just a barrier. Agency is just a barrier. It's the way that the system's been set up for 200 years. It's just telling us how we will do things. We have to follow along. When I did studies on peace subjects at university, And they tell you at university that governments are not there to help people. They're there to control people. And that to me was mind-blowing. I hadn't even thought of it that way. And when you sit back and you go, actually, now it makes sense. And you see the agency or state, that is exactly, it is set up to control masses, to keep things calm, running smoothly, doing the right thing, and we all live great lives, in certainly when I'm in Brisbane City, brilliant lives. But when you start to head inland or remote, you can see that just falls away. It's not important, and the systems are not set up to include us. And there's not that, really, it's not that care. There isn't a care on how our families are or how they are progressing or how well they're going to do. And, it just worries me. It does worry me. And I look at how families are there's just no need for it in today's day and age.
Well, how do you deal with the worry? That's a question I have, because, if you have to look at kind of bad situations a lot, it's hard to have that fire burning in your heart every single day, waking up in the morning saying, I'm going to do something. I'm going to be a positive influence with other people. How do you kind of motivate yourself, Toni?
I'm one of those people that does 1,000,000 miles an hour, full steam ahead. That's why I wrote a book. Mm-hmm. But yes, look, it's that sense of humour. And Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, we have a sense of humour. We laugh it off. We use it in strange ways that people probably will, if we've been, if we're out in the middle of Brisbane and people overheard our conversations, they probably think we're very strange with our sense of humour. But we do. We laugh it through. We make fun of it. We try and make light of the heaviness, across all the different parts of our lives. And that is very obvious. I mean, I remember one time we were actually on a fun golf day, and we're up on the golf course in Mackay, and it was an Indigenous golf day. My husband was there, and he said, I've never, ever heard so much laughter, he said, or so much on a golf course or anywhere. He said, I just didn't expect that. And I just looked at him and think, what are you talking about? What are you talking about? And I looked around and I thought, well, this is normal. This is normal. I expect this. This is quite what I would, coming out, the whole of our communities out here. We were having a fun day together. Definitely that sense of humour coming across. But yes, when I sort of sat back and thought from his perspective, it was very different, and it was bizarre, but since then we've trained him, so it's okay. Okay. We've brought him along for the journey.
Right. Now, you're really big on education. I think you also have been, along with being a scientist, you've been an educator, and you wrote a whole chapter on education for climate change adaptation, and especially for Indigenous people to receive more education, and also non-Indigenous people to receive education about the Indigenous situation. So I'm wondering if you could tell us about your perspective on education.
Oh, education is the key to health and well-being, isn't it? There's plenty of examples of that. Even just having children a bit later after if your daughters are educated. So, when I look at it, my eldest daughter is an environmental scientist. My son is a builder. And my youngest daughter is at university studying urban planning. Wow. Or urban and environmental planning. So when I think from the age of 2, probably, I've been saying, go to university, go and travel, then worry about the rest of life. So it was just try every day, go to university, go travel. And something must have stuck. So they've gone through and they've done their bit. But it is really important that we start to educate just generally, educate about climate change, because it's only by knowing how we will be impacted as to then we know what we have to do to adapt, to fix, to reduce the impact. So it's only by knowing those things. And then when we look at mainstream Australia, and then to it would be it is really important to share our experiences and our culture, because then we can be proud of it. Other people can then understand, how amazing our culture is. It's not until I've started myself researching paleo climate adaptation for my PhD, and when I'm reading through and I've gone, oh my goodness, I didn't know this even myself, and I feel so proud knowing all these different parts of our culture, which we just aren't taught in schools, and we only learn songlines and stories for our areas, for our homelands. So to be able to learn across Australia all those different things is amazing. But it would be good then, I think, because then we can just reduce the racism. I have friends and I have relatives, even on that Facebook. I've only just joined Facebook in the last 6 months. And,
okay.
And you see the things come across there, and I'm thinking, I just don't understand this. Why we've gone through the same schooling, we had the same upbringing, but why do you feel this about Aboriginal people when, you've grown up with me, or you've grown up in an area with Indigenous people? So there's some people have some unusual things, and I just think that's education. Where did it lack? What's been missing? What didn't come through? So I'm not sure if I've been clear there, but look, education is the key. It's the key to our success. It's the key to our survival in the end, and it's definitely the key to how well we adapt. We need to know what we're facing.
Right. So you're working on your PhD right now.
Yes, I am. Yes.
Okay. And so what is it going to be when it's finished? Like, what's the title?
Oh, the title. Oh, goodness. Well, I didn't even come up with the title of my book until about 3 weeks before I I published it. Look, I don't know the title, but it's across paleo, as I said, Aboriginal adaptation, but it's also including all those key factors that we have, so displacement, so we're having to move, and all those the things that it's the things in my book I thought a chapter just didn't do justice to. So people have said to me, why didn't you include more culture in there? And I thought, well, because it deserves more than one chapter. Right. There's so much, and it's so important. So why I figured that to me meant I needed to write another maybe book? A book or a paper on that. Yes, because it definitely needs more than a chapter. So I've been looking at that.
Yeah, I was
sorry.
Now, is it true? Sorry for cutting you off there. I have to learn the conversation skills where kind of things flow together where I don't seem like I'm cutting people off. That's a skill I need to learn. But I was wondering, I was reading up on Australia's Indigenous peoples, and I heard that people have been there on the continent of Australia maybe much longer than other places. And so the culture is going through like tens of thousands of years. Is that right? Or did I misread it?
Yeah, so it depends where you look. The latest, I guess, agreed upon is about 75,000 years. So that's the latest. But if you start to look at other different types of sciences or engineering, they all seem to have a different date. So to me, it seems to be somewhere between 75,000 years and about 110,000 years seems to be about where I see it. There was also research the other day I saw come in about the genomes, I think it was, and Indigenous Australian Aboriginal people have, I think it's all of the genomes from. So everyone must, I think the reading was that everyone must have come from Aboriginal people. So, I'm not into that area. That's not my specialty, but I just had a quick read and I went, oh, that's interesting. We'll see how that comes and evolves, as time goes on. But yes, thousands of years. And we have thousands of years of stories, or songlines or stories. So we have stories every time a geologic event happens. One of them is from the Tablelands north of Cairns, and they had the volcanoes erupting. So, one of the stories I tell when I'm doing my climate adaptations, that strengths-based practice, so I'm trying to reduce the long-term impacts and harms. So we do strengths-based. So it's around, okay, so 10,000 years ago, above the in the tablelands above Cairns, the volcanoes erupted. Our people, they survived. We can see today the trails that they followed. So I do the whole story that we can see that the foods that they ate, and they threw down the seeds, and today those fruit trees are sprouting. So it's developed that whole story and that plan of our people strong enough. We saw the problem and we moved away, and we can still see today how well we did through the paths that we walked down. So that's one of the processes I go through with the adaptation planning. It is trying to bring that strength into the sad story that we have to do something or we have to move. So be making it as positive a thing on that as we can.
And so if you look at all the tens of thousands of years, this long history on the Australian continent, colonization is only like the last, say, 200 years. It's kind of a blip on the radar screen in time, but the impact has been just as bad as seamless climate change. It's just been a bad impact. But just looking at that timeline, you think, wow, like that just speaks to me of resilience. It does. I hope I'm not sugarcoating things, but if you can survive Europeans coming there and kind of taking over everything and still be there today, then it's a position of strength, I think, to have been there for so long and have such a rich knowledge, and people should respect that.
Oh, absolutely. And when you're on country, some of the knowledge that is handed down, no scientist knows that, and that's, I've gone and I've learnt science, and then I'm putting it on top of the cultural and the traditional knowledge, and then you're sort of looking at the two, and in my mind the traditional knowledge is a lot better in a lot of ways than what we're actually seeing with the science. It's just that the science it does it, it quantifies, I guess. So that's probably the main point that I see. But when you go out on country, it is absolutely amazing. You can go through, you can see. So the people up in the communities where I grew up is when the bottle brush come in, they know that the brim will be coming through. So those sorts of stories, you can tell. It is. Look, to put this into perspective, even we have scientists that come up on country to learn our ways, and then go back into the science world, and they're traditional ecological knowledge experts, or they're Indigenous experts, but they had to come up and learn from the real experts, which is our people on country, and then they go back. The unfortunate part is then that we are represented at medium to high levels, all by non-Indigenous people. So our say seems to be at the bottom levels. We don't have that voice in the medium layer. We don't have that voice going up through to the higher levels of national or international level. It then becomes, well, I actually would say it's actually unethical to take and speak for us still at the at all throughout the levels of government right the way. So that's something that does occur, and it's not very ethical. And I think it's now at that stage, there are enough Indigenous scientists, there are enough Indigenous people who are well and truly educated, prepared, ready, whatever, to be speaking for our peoples rather than having non-Indigenous speaking for us. But, that's probably another battle for another day.
But I think just you speaking out, Toni, and writing this book and then going on a book launch tour or whatever things you're doing, I think you're shifting your culture there. It sounds like people have not heard this before. And just you speaking out, you're shifting the general public's mindset and culture. So it sounds like it can have a real great influence. So because if you didn't do it and other people didn't do it, it would just be like business as usual and nothing would change. So yeah.
It's funny you say that, Vin, because when I speak to people and they ask, what do you do? And I say, I do a climate adaptation, and, my specialty is Indigenous climate adaptation. And it's kind of like they just dismiss it. It's like, oh, is that all? Is that all? Oh, okay. She doesn't do the real stuff. But it's actually far harder to do Indigenous and the most vulnerable, then far harder to come up with programs that reach those levels than it is to do mainstream. But people don't see it that way. So it's funny, those conversations that I have out and about are very easily dismissed, and they just don't quite realise to do that. It's actually at a whole nother level, and it's again that whole different way of thinking. It's about thinking community based. It's about thinking the well-being of our people and the best for them. It's not just about doing what we statutory things that we have to do, or meet. It's about taking that extra step to do well by the people. And that's all it is, But as I said, dismissed very easily. So it's frustrating for me. Right. Like, again, a reason to write a book.
Yeah, exactly. And remember, they're only dismissing one person, but if your kids and then especially young Indigenous people become scientists, become advocates, and their voice gets out into the public, hopefully it'll just be more and more, and people can't ignore it. They can't dismiss you so easily. So, yeah.
That's right. Let's hope so.
Yeah, exactly. Now, I'm wondering, kind of shifting a little bit here, what about natural resources management? You wrote a chapter on that. And this is one of the key elements for life and also for climate change adaptation, is managing natural resources. So I'm wondering what you have to say about that.
I think a lot of people don't realise that Indigenous peoples across the world, but yes, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, we have ranger programs and different varying programs, very similar. So all that. And what we are already doing is pest management. So all the pest species, which will become, worse as time goes on. So it's about managing those. And that allows the natural biodiversity to survive and to do better. It's about monitoring biodiversity. It's about putting supports in for all the different biodiversity types out in country. So all those programs, we're already doing that. That is adaptation. And that's I don't think, as I was saying, people realise the amount of work that Indigenous peoples do. And we do it because we love the country. We want to do it. It's to make our homelands better. In the climate adaptation world, it's a huge amount of work that we really need. Biodiversity is in major trouble. And that will, in the end, probably cause us to see how resilient we will be as to how many of the biodiversity, sort of don't survive this. So when we're looking at that, and we look at all that work going in, all those supports, helping the biodiversity, and the people doing this are helping everyday non-Indigenous people, helping the world in itself. One of the things in Australia, 40% of the land is managed by Indigenous people. I think somewhere I read it's like 75 or 80% of the world's natural resources are managed by Indigenous people. So I say, how on earth can we expect to mitigate or adapt if Indigenous people are not included? The major land masses are looked after by us. There's no way that any mitigation or adaptation plans will ever succeed without including us. So, you're looking at that. So when you look then at mainstream as the adaptation plans, and we are not included, we are not represented on pretty much any level at the moment across the world. So in comparison, you're thinking, what on earth is going on? Why on earth aren't we? You're saying you want to meet these. You're saying you want to adapt. You're saying you want to reduce, emissions. and yet we're not included. We're not spoken to. We don't have a big part in that. We don't even have a part in that. So how on earth are people seeing this? How on earth are they rolling these out and not actually acknowledging that it cannot be done without us? It's just, I have to laugh because it's just crazy. Yeah.
Right. I'm wondering, Toni, do you have any connections at the United Nations, so say on an international level? And is there any way for getting that kind of international United Nations pressure to go onto the Australian government and people?
Well, yeah, look, I don't know. I don't know about the politics, at those sorts of levels. I think that we certainly need a voice. And I believe that there is a group of people that are pushing to have an extra SDG for Indigenous peoples. And then to have that voice, I don't know at this point whether that's actually been achieved yet, but I'm hoping so. But I haven't spoken to the people for about 6 or 7 months, so I'm not sure. We definitely need to have that voice. We are key players in this throughout the world. And yet we're not represented as such. And as I said, it's just unethical not to. As to put pressure on governments, well, there are also, look, I'm going to be throwing a spanner in the works here, Vin, but the United Nations and their subsidiary organisations do not have Indigenous peoples representing Indigenous peoples. So if they don't have it, how do they put pressure on any government to do the right thing and do the same? So, I question that.
Yeah, I'm just trying to look at this
doing the right thing too.
I'm just trying to look at this from different levels. I had a guest actually a couple of weeks ago who's he deals with climate change adaptation, but with the United Nations, and it sounds like a lot of work. There's all the time just grinding, letting the voice get out there. And it's not easy work, but he loves it. But you have a great example you were mentioning right beside you with New Zealand. So maybe Australia can kind of compete with Australia. Both countries can compete to see who can listen to Indigenous peoples more and do better at their climate adaptation, right? I mean, it's great to have a good example next door, right?
I think that the way that they're going about their adaptation is in including Indigenous voice is definitely better. Australia's already developed their climate adaptation plans, so they've been in place for many years. So they would actually have to go back and as an afterthought, include us. So it's because they're at different stages. But yes, New Zealand is rolling it out now, their adaptation, and yes, they are including that Indigenous voice far more and having inclusive traditional knowledge throughout and those conversations and bringing everybody along for the journey. Whereas Australia rolled theirs out over the last 10 years and depending on where it is, and, they just went bang, put it in and crossed mainstream, and that was sort of it. So there are good pros and cons for both ways, but Australia now needs to, in my view, go back and start to look at how do we bring everybody along for that journey.
Exactly. Now, at the end of the book, you said this word is called kui. Am I saying it right? And this is kind of like your call. It's like, wake up, people, kui, right? I guess I need a higher voice. Kui.
That's it. I'm not sure I should do it on here. But yes, when if people are lost, you do it's a coo-wee. So if you're out in the bush, you do the call, and it's a call to find me. I'm lost, to find me. It's also a call for a meeting. We're going to have a meeting, so come here. So coo-wee.
Okay.
Coo-wee. So I put that in the story, in the book, because to me, we are partly lost. We are all working in different parts but no one's coming together. So we need to meet, and we need to come together, and we need to share knowledge, and we need to build our strength and our information and our education together. So that's why I use the word kui. So yes, it's very important that we start this action now, because we're already feeling the impacts now. It's not a future thing. It's already occurring. And, we're going to see things, as I said, that 20, 30 years for our peoples is going to be very poor for them.
Right, exactly.
I think there was even one of the I can't think of it exactly, but one of the references in the book, and it said in there that even, I think it might have been the Human Rights Commission from there, and it even said in there that even mainstream community, like in developed nations, your middle class people will be impacted greatly, and they will be struggling. So it's going to be, you and I, really, we're going to be struggling. Anyone underneath, they're going to be in a real pickle. So, that's something to keep in mind. It's going to be impacting us badly. Then yes, anyone below that is going to be really in trouble in those most risk areas. So we need to come together. We need to share our knowledge. We need to start our adaptation now.
Right. Now, Toni, you don't come across to me as a pessimistic person. You come across as a dreamer. You know the reality. You're not going to sugarcoat it, but you also are a dreamer. And you know that dreams can come true. Not all of them, but some of them can at least come true. So I'm wondering, what are your dreams, Toni?
What are my dreams? I would really love to see, that all of a sudden we become included in decision making, that it becomes, part of a normal life, so our children don't even have this discussion again, because our grandparents had this discussion, our parents had this discussion, I'm having this discussion. So it's about time, our children didn't have to do this anymore. So working with government, better outcomes, or I think they call it I can't think right now, but there's another word that they use, impacts. They've got rid of outcomes. They're calling it impact now. So better impact programs and that. And we may actually have a chance to have to do better out of this. The research, look, it's really hard reading that every single day, research after research after research, and they are not good. And it is now at the point where, there's so much research on it. It certainly can't be disputed about climate change, but it's very heavy. It's not good. And you can only have that dream that we will somehow snap out of it, work together and do the right thing, do the ethical thing by all people, and bring everybody along with us. Bring everyone. Why not? Bring us all, so from all walks of life. It's not that much harder to develop programs to reach them. If, you just have to take that extra thinking, that extra planning, and including community. It can be done. We're seeing it being done. So, I really hope this does happen. If enough people maybe read my book or start to think this way and realize that there's a problem and we need to fix it. So there is a problem. There's a big problem. It's going to get bigger. So these are the things we can start to look at, and then plus others, but these are the basics. And then, work together to fix this. So I don't know about a dreamer, but I think I'm still realistic that it can be done. It's just, governments need to be a bit more flexible, and people need to be a bit more open-minded. And maybe as the younger ones start to reach management positions and decision-making, they might be smart enough to help make these changes too. Right.
Wow. That's wonderful, Toni. You're a real inspiration to me. So I just want to thank you for being a guest here at Multi Hazards.
Thank you for inviting me, Vin. I'm just so privileged to be on your podcast. It's just amazing the amount of people that the skill of the people that you have. I can't believe it. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Thanks. All right. And have a good weekend and good week. Take care. And that's a wrap. This was a great conversation. Thanks to my wonderful guest, Toni Hay, for joining me at the Multi Hazards podcast. and a little innocent and yet so important disclaimer here. First of all, this podcast is meant to be educational and does not try to offer legal, medical, or other specific advice unless otherwise noted. Second, the opinions expressed here do not necessarily reflect those of the organizations that either me or my guests are working with or volunteering with. So, here as I conclude this episode, thank you, all of you, my wonderful listeners, for tuning in today. Stay safe out there and come back for more episodes. This is Vin Nelson wishing you the best on your journey of surviving and thriving with all that life throws at you. Cheers to you all. Peace out.